everybody. So Friday you'll have your quiz in here, and it's going to be on all about photosynthesis, so I'll end the period a little bit early for that. No exam next week, but I think there's an exam coming up the week after next week. I'll let you know next week when we start meeting again. Guess I don't have any comments other than that. Any questions about anything to me before I start in? All right, let's jump into it. We are on cellular respiration now, and the basic idea is that cells need this ATP molecule to power their proteins, but they constantly, whenever the cells use an ATP molecule for energy, whenever the proteins use an ATP molecule for energy, it gets split apart into an ADP, an adenosine diphosphate, and an inorganic phosphate, or PI as they call it. And it requires energy to bring those two back together to reform the ATPs. And that energy, by and large, comes from the energy in glucose. So cells are constantly sucking in glucose to recharge their ATP supply. And that process of breaking down the glucose to recharge the ATP is called cellular respiration, which is our topic for today. But there are two varieties of cellular respiration. They both involve taking in glucose and breaking it down to recharge ATP, but one uses oxygen to break down the glucose. That's cellular aerobic respiration. And the other does not use oxygen to break down the glucose. That's called cellular anaerobic respiration. This is the type that our bodies use the most, the aerobic variety, which is incidentally why we breathe in air, is to get oxygen into our blood so that our cells have some oxygen to do this process. If you look at the overall equation, it tells you that for every glucose that a cell takes in, the cell also has to take in 6 molecules of oxygen, O2, from the blood. And it uses the oxygen to break down the glucose into 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. You breathe out the carbon dioxide. Every time you breathe out, you're breathing out the CO2. And the water molecules just become other water molecules in your body. And for each glucose that gets broken down by cellular aerobic respiration, the cell is able to recharge 36 ATPs. Now, maybe I should go on a slight tangent subject here. When I was learning this stuff years and years ago, they definitely told us 36 ATPs per glucose. And I think recently, some recent research has been tweaking that finding. Your textbook may no longer say exactly 36, but if it's not 36, it's in the neighborhood of 36, so we'll just use that as our number. Glucose is the normal fuel. That's the preferred fuel that cells like to use for this process. But if there's not enough glucose available in the blood, they can switch to fatty acids in the blood. That's fine. We burn those just fine. If there's not enough glucose or fatty acids, they can switch to amino acids, but the cells really don't like to use those. They'd rather use the amino acids for building their proteins. Oh yeah, and don't forget that plants and animals do this aerobic respiration process. Alrighty, let's see. I think the next slide was a potential energy diagram of the process. Remember that carbon dioxide is as low in energy as a carbon atom can get inside living things, because all its bonds are to oxygen, and those are low energy covalent bonds. And so glucose, which has some high energy carbon hydrogens and some medium energy carbon bonds, definitely has higher potential energy. So it's an exergonic, spontaneous downhill reaction. And the energy that the glucose is losing as it goes through this process is what the ATPs are gaining. Okay, so that's an overview of aerobic respiration. The anaerobic respiration is the one that doesn't use oxygen. And maybe I should mention where or when it occurs in our bodies. So most of the time, you're using aerobic respiration. But every now and then, your cells, especially your muscle cells, have to switch into anaerobic respiration. When are those times? Well, short bursts of energy is a good way to describe it. Here I am sitting around the house, and the wife says, hey, lift up that couch, I want a vacuum clean underneath it. So I grab hold of it and lift it up there. So I think you'll buy that for that brief moment, my muscles had to expend a lot of energy. I was relaxing, doing nothing, then all of a sudden here I am holding this couch, and I don't know how much it weighs, like 75 pounds or something like that. So there's a huge energy demand on the muscle cells, so they have to use a lot more ATP than they did before I was lifting the couch. But there's a limit to how fast the blood can transfer the oxygen to the muscle cells. That oxygen just doesn't transport itself instantly from the blood. There's a rate at how fast it can flow. And so sometimes when you're exerting yourself very strongly for a sudden burst of activity, your cells aren't able to gather in enough oxygen from the blood to do aerobic respiration. There's just not enough of that for the aerobic respiration process. So your cells, especially the muscle cells, can, in those situations, switch over to this other process, the anaerobic respiration. Or maybe I should say they're forced to switch over to this process since they can't get enough oxygen from the blood in that instant. And this is good because it allows them to break down glucose and get ATP out of it, even though they're not getting enough oxygen from the blood to do the aerobic respiration. Here's the equation for it. Oh, well, here's a cartoon of it. There's the muscle cell. When it's forced to do anaerobic respiration, it takes in glucose out of the blood and breaks it apart into two molecules of something called lactic acid. And it's able to get some ATP out of that process. Now, it's a heck of a lot lower yield than aerobic respiration, Gesundheit. Remember, aerobic respiration, the cell gets 36 out of ATPs from every glucose. Here, it's only 2. So I guess you'd say it has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that we don't need oxygen to perform it, and the disadvantage is it has a really low yield, energy yield. And why does it have such a low yield? Well, remember, you get the energy by moving something to a lower potential energy level, and glucose is higher than lactic acid, but not that much higher. It's just not a big drop, so only 2 ATPs worth of energy can be extracted from it. And to put this in perspective, think of it as gas mileage. If you had one car that got 2 miles per gallon and another car that got 36 miles per gallon, well, it's a no-brainer. You drive this car all the time. And so that's why your body really tries to stay in aerobic respiration mode, but only when it's forced into it by you doing a sudden burst of activity, does it very briefly go into anaerobic respiration mode. But as soon as your body can, it switches back into aerobic respiration because it doesn't want to waste all those glucoses by only getting 2 ATPs per glucose. It could be getting 36 ATPs per glucose. Yeah.
The anaerobic really done in animals?
No, microbes can do it also. I was just kind of introducing it. I'm glad you mentioned it. I was going to tell you about some microbes here again in a second. Let's see. All right, so, oh yeah, before I leave anaerobic respiration in animals, so this is the main disadvantage, that you only get 2 ATPs per glucose. Another sort of disadvantage is this: the lactic acid that's produced gives your muscles a burning sensation. You probably felt as if you've been holding something heavy for a long time, or if you're hiking up a hill and your thighs start burning. That is the lactic acid that's burning up inside your muscles. And it doesn't actually hurt your muscles. You'll never damage your muscles from too much lactic acid, but it does just make them feel a little bit uncomfortable for a while. All right, now, some microscopic organisms constantly find themselves in a low oxygen environment, and so some of these organisms have to or constantly use anaerobic respiration. And a good example of that are yeast, which are single cells relatives of the mushrooms. They're in the fungus family, and they use these to make wine and beer and other types of alcohol, things like that. What they do is, at least for the winemaking, is they mix the yeast in with grape juice as a sugar source and put it inside these airtight barrels like you see here. And then since there's no significant oxygen in there, the yeast are forced to do anaerobic respiration, so they break down the glucose. Now, most microscopic organisms, when they're doing anaerobic respiration, do a slightly different style. Instead of breaking the glucose down into 2 molecules of lactic acid, they break it down into 2 molecules of alcohol and 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. It's still anaerobic respiration, and it still yields 2 ATPs per glucose, but the final products are alcohol and carbon dioxide instead of lactic acids. And you know, if they're using this to make wine or beer, then those are alcoholic beverages. So this is sort of the reason why we're carrying out that process. But it's also used in bread making. They mix the yeast in with dough, and then the yeast converts some of the glucose from the starch in the dough into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And in that situation, what we want is the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is what causes the bread to rise up. And what happens to the alcohol, when you bake the bread, the alcohol just evaporates off in the oven, but the CO2 is what rises up the bread. Okay, well, what we're going to do for the rest of this period is focus in on the aerobic respiration, the oxygen-using one. And we'll come back to this maybe next week after we've talked about the aerobic respiration. This is an artist's depiction of cell. I guess it's supposed to be an animal cell because it doesn't have any chloroplasts or cell wall. Most of the steps of aerobic respiration take place in an organelle called a mitochondria, which you can see. Here's a mitochondria, and here's another mitochondria. They're only showing 2 mitochondria inside this particular cell. Oh, maybe there's a third one over there. But actually, it's typically a larger number than that. And I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but many mitochondria you find inside cells. And interestingly, the mitochondria have a circular chromosome of their own. And what does that remind us of? What other organelle? Chloroplast, yeah. And at that time, when we were discussing chloroplasts, I said the reason why I think chloroplasts have their little circular chromosome is that they are believed to, billions of years ago, have been a free-living photosynthetic bacteria that somehow was taken in by a eukaryotic cell and eventually evolved into an organelle. They think that's the same thing with these mitochondria, that sometime in the way distant past, they were some sort of bacteria that was really good at making ATP from glucose, and so a eukaryotic cell took it inside and eventually evolved into an organelle. It's not an organelle now, but it still retains that circular chromosome from when it is an organelle now, not a bacteria, but it still retains that circular chromosome from when it was a bacteria. And just like bacteria, they actually have their own ribosomes inside them. They're in some ways like a tiny little cell. And they're about the size of bacteria also.
Are mitochondria in our body the same size with different cells?
I believe they are. Yes, as far as I know they are. Alrighty, so let's take a closer look at the mitochondria, since that's where most of the aerobic respiration takes place. The mitochondria is a double membrane organelle, has a smooth outer phospholipid bilayer there, and a highly folded phospholipid bilayer inside. And again, if this reminds you a little bit of the chloroplast, maybe it's not too surprising. The chloroplast had 2 membranes called the envelope, 2 smooth membranes on the outside and a folded one inside. Well, the mitochondria just has 1 smooth membrane on the outside, but a folded one inside. The innermost area, the space that's enclosed by the inner membrane, is called the inner compartment or the matrix. The folds of the inner membrane are called the cristae. You see the word right there. And just as a review, what do you call the folds in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast? It begins with a G. Granum, right. And so the cristae, in a sense, are like the granum. They are the folds of the inner membrane. The outer membrane, the space between the outer membrane and the inner membrane can be called the intermembrane space or the outer compartment. I guess this is the inner compartment in here, so that's the outer compartment there. And here's sort of my own version of the same thing. The cristae matrix or inner compartment there. The outer compartment or the intermembrane space is there. Okay. Now, somewhere in your textbook is a diagram like this, that shows the steps of aerobic respiration. And recall, in photosynthesis, there were two main steps.